There is no contradiction in the electrical code regarding the use of non-metallic sheathed cable and thermal barriers. The code specifies that cables must be concealed within walls, floors, or ceilings that provide a thermal barrier with at least a 15-minute finish rating, like 1/2 inch sheetrock. This requirement ensures that cables are protected from fire. However, there's an exception for non-metallic sheathed cables, also known as NMC. NMC cables are permitted for both exposed and concealed work in dry, moist, damp, or corrosive locations, except where specifically prohibited in Section 334.10(3) of the Electrical Code. This means that NMC cables can be run outside of walls, floors, or ceilings without needing the 15-minute thermal barrier, provided they are not in a location where such exposed use is forbidden. The key distinction lies in the type of cable. The general rule requiring concealment behind a thermal barrier applies to most cable types to enhance fire safety. The exception for NMC cable recognizes its properties and acceptable use in various environmental conditions, allowing it to be either concealed or exposed, adhering to 334.10(3). Therefore, the code is not contradictory. It provides a general requirement for most cables and a specific exception for NMC cable, which is clearly defined. Understanding these specific exceptions and requirements is essential for proper electrical installations and code compliance. It's always important to consult the latest version of the electrical code and seek guidance from a qualified electrician or electrical inspector when in doubt. Section 334.10(3) outlines the specific locations where NMC cable is prohibited. These prohibitions are in place to prevent the use of NMC cable in environments where it might be damaged or create a safety hazard. For example, NMC cable is typically not allowed in underground installations embedded in concrete or aggregate, or where exposed to physical damage. This is because the non-metallic sheath of the cable is not designed to withstand these conditions, and it could become damaged, leading to electrical faults or fire hazards. In summary, the code permits the use of NMC cable in various applications, but it also sets limitations on where it can be used. These limitations are in place to ensure that the cable is used safely and effectively. When installing NMC cable, it's important to follow all applicable code requirements and manufacturer instructions. This will help ensure that the installation is safe and compliant with local regulations. The phrase permitted use number 3 refers to a specific section within a set of electrical codes or regulations. It is a section that outlines the conditions under which certain types of electrical installations are allowed. Specifically, it states that cables must be concealed within walls, floors, or ceilings that provide a thermal barrier of material that has at least a 15-minute finish rating. This requirement is in place to protect the cables from fire damage and to prevent the spread of fire through the building. The 15-minute finish rating refers to the amount of time that the thermal barrier can withstand exposure to fire before it begins to fail. Materials such as 1/2 inch sheetrock are commonly used as thermal barriers because they are relatively inexpensive and easy to install, and they provide a sufficient level of fire protection. The section also mentions NMC cables, which are permitted to be used in both exposed and concealed work in dry, moist, damp, or corrosive locations, except as prohibited in Section 334.10(3) of the Code. This means that NMC cables can be used in a wider range of applications than other types of cables, but they are still subject to certain restrictions. For example, NMC cables are not allowed to be used in hazardous locations or where they are exposed to physical damage. It's important to note that the electrical code is a complex set of regulations, and it's always best to consult with a qualified electrician or electrical inspector to ensure that your electrical installations are compliant with the code. Failing to comply with the electrical code can result in fines, penalties, and even legal action. Additionally, non-compliant electrical installations can pose a serious safety hazard, potentially leading to fires, electrical shocks, and other injuries. The purpose of the thermal barrier is to slow down the spread of fire. By concealing cables within walls, floors, or ceilings that have a 15-minute finish rating, the cables are protected from direct exposure to flames and heat. This helps to prevent the cables from melting or igniting, which could contribute to the spread of fire. The 15-minute rating means that the barrier can withstand exposure to fire for at least 15 minutes before it begins to fail. This provides valuable time for occupants to evacuate the building and for firefighters to arrive and extinguish the fire. While NMC cables are permitted to be used in a wider range of applications, they are still subject to certain restrictions. These restrictions are in place to ensure that the cables are used safely and effectively. For example, NMC cables are not allowed to be used in hazardous locations or where they are exposed to physical damage. This is because NMC cables are not as durable as other types of cables, and they can be easily damaged if they are not properly protected. When installing NMC cables, it's important to follow all applicable code requirements and manufacturer instructions. This will help ensure that the installation is safe and compliant with local regulations. It's also important to select the appropriate size and type of NMC cable for the application. Using the wrong size or type of cable can result in overheating, electrical shorts, and other problems. Consulting with a qualified electrician or electrical inspector can help to ensure that you select the right cable for your needs. Section 334.10(3) of the Electrical Code specifies the locations where NMC cable is not permitted to be used. These locations typically include areas where the cable is exposed to physical damage, hazardous locations, and underground installations. The specific requirements vary depending on the jurisdiction, so it is important to consult the local electrical code for complete details. Exposed work refers to electrical wiring that is visible and not concealed behind walls, floors, or ceilings. Concealed work, on the other hand, refers to wiring that is hidden from view. NMC cable is permitted to be used in both exposed and concealed work, as long as it meets the requirements of the electrical code. In exposed work, the cable must be properly supported and protected from physical damage. This can be accomplished by using cable staples, cable ties, or other approved methods. In concealed work, a cable must be installed in accordance with the requirements of the electrical code, including the use of appropriate boxes and fittings. Dry, moist, damp, or corrosive locations are all types of environments where electrical wiring may be installed. Dry locations are areas that are not normally subject to moisture. Moist locations are areas that are subject to occasional moisture, such as bathrooms and laundry rooms. Damp locations are areas that are subject to continuous moisture, such as basements and crawl spaces. Corrosive locations are areas that are exposed to chemicals or other substances that can corrode electrical wiring. NMC cable is permitted to be used in all of these types of locations, as long as it is properly installed and protected. The phrase "as prohibited" in 334.10(3) refers to a specific exception to the general rule allowing NMC cable to be used in various locations. This section of the code lists specific places or conditions where NMC cable is not allowed, overriding the broader permission. For example, 334.10(3) might prohibit NMC cable in certain hazardous locations due to the risk of explosion or fire, or in underground applications where the cable could be damaged by moisture or physical stress. Understanding this exception is crucial because it clarifies that while NMC cable is versatile, it's not universally applicable and must be used according to the specific restrictions outlined in 334.10(3). Electrical codes and regulations like the National Electrical Code or NEC are comprehensive sets of guidelines designed to ensure the safe installation and operation of electrical systems. They cover a wide range of topics, including wiring methods, overcurrent protection, grounding, and equipment installation. These codes are developed and maintained by organizations such as the National Fire Protection Association or NFPA and are adopted by state and local jurisdictions. The primary goal of electrical codes is to protect people and property from electrical hazards. By following the code requirements, electricians and contractors can minimize the risk of electrical shocks, fires, and other accidents. The codes also help to ensure that electrical systems are reliable and efficient. In addition to the NEC, there may be other states and local electrical codes that apply to specific installations. It's important to be aware of all applicable codes and regulations before starting any electrical work. Electrical codes are constantly evolving to keep pace with new technologies and changing safety standards. It's important to stay up to date on the latest code requirements to ensure that your electrical work is safe and compliant. Consulting with a qualified electrician or electrical inspector can help to ensure that you are following all applicable codes and regulations. Failing to comply with electrical codes can result in fines, penalties, and even legal action. Additionally, non-compliant electrical installations can pose a serious safety hazard, potentially leading to fires, electrical shocks, and other injuries. Therefore, it's essential to take electrical codes seriously and to follow them diligently. When there's an apparent contradiction in a set of rules or regulations, it's crucial to understand the intent and context behind each statement. In the case of electrical codes, seemingly contradictory statements often exist to address different scenarios or provide specific exceptions to general rules. To resolve an apparent contradiction, it's necessary to carefully examine the wording of each statement and consider the specific circumstances to which it applies. It may also be helpful to consult with experts or authorities who are knowledgeable about the rules and regulations in question. In many cases, the apparent contradiction can be resolved by recognizing that one statement is a general rule, while the other is a specific exception to that rule. The exception is intended to apply only in certain situations, while the general rule applies in all other situations. Another way to resolve an apparent contradiction is to consider the intent behind each statement. The rules may be designed to achieve different goals or address different concerns. By understanding the intent behind each statement, it may be possible to reconcile the apparent contradiction and apply the rules in a way that is consistent with their overall purpose. In some cases, an apparent contradiction may be the result of an error or oversight in the drafting of the rules. If this is the case, it may be necessary to seek clarification or amendment of the rules to eliminate the contradiction. Ultimately, the key to resolving an apparent contradiction is to carefully analyze the rules and regulations in question, consider the intent behind each statement, and consult with experts or authorities when necessary. By taking these steps, it's possible to apply the rules in a way that is consistent with their overall purpose and avoids unintended consequences. The National Electrical Code, or NEC, is updated every 3 years to reflect changes in technology and safety practices. It's important to use the latest edition of the code to ensure that your electrical work is up to date and compliant. The NEC is a comprehensive document that covers a wide range of electrical topics. It's organized into chapters, articles, and sections, each addressing a specific aspect of electrical installations. Navigating the NEC can be challenging, but there are resources available to help you understand the code requirements. These resources include training courses, online forums, and publications from organizations such as the National Fire Protection Association. It's also helpful to consult with a qualified electrician or electrical inspector when you have questions about the NEC. They can provide expert guidance and help you ensure that your electrical work is compliant with the code. The NEC is not a static document. It's constantly evolving to keep pace with new technologies and changing safety standards. It's important to stay informed about the latest code changes to ensure that your electrical work is safe and compliant. The NEC is a valuable resource for anyone involved in electrical work. By understanding and following the code requirements, you can help to ensure that electrical systems are safe, reliable, and efficient. Always remember that safety is the top priority when working with electricity. Follow all applicable codes and regulations, and take precautions to protect yourself and others from electrical hazards. A code exception is a specific provision that allows a deviation from a general rule under certain conditions. Exceptions are included in codes and standards to address situations where the general rule may not be practical or appropriate. Understanding exceptions is crucial for proper code application. The code exception for NMC cables in 334.10.3 is a good example. It allows NMC cables to be used in specific situations where the general rule requiring thermal barriers might otherwise apply. To properly apply a code exception, you must first understand the general rule and the specific conditions under which the exception applies. The exception will usually state these conditions explicitly. If the conditions are met, you can then apply the exception and deviate from the general rule. It is important to document the use of any code exception, including the specific conditions that justify its use. This documentation can be helpful in the event of an inspection or if questions arise later about the installation. Code exceptions are not intended to be loopholes or ways to circumvent the intent of the code. They are intended to address specific situations where the general rule is not appropriate. Therefore, it is important to use code exceptions responsibly and only when the specific conditions are met. In cases where there is doubt about whether a code exception applies, it is always best to consult with a qualified electrician or electrical inspector. They can help you to interpret the code and determine whether the exception is applicable in your situation. The electrical code is a complex and ever-changing document. Understanding code exceptions is essential for proper code application and for ensuring the safety of electrical installations. Always stay up to date on the latest code changes and consult with qualified professionals when needed. The general rule states that cables shall be concealed within walls, floors, or ceilings that provide a thermal barrier of material that has at least a 15-minute finish rating. This rule is designed to protect cables from fire damage and to prevent the spread of fire through the building. The thermal barrier helps to slow down the spread of fire by providing a layer of insulation between the cables and the flames. The 15-minute rating means that the barrier can withstand exposure to fire for at least 15 minutes before it begins to fail. This provides valuable time for occupants to evacuate the building and for firefighters to arrive and extinguish the fire. Materials such as 1/2-inch sheetrock are commonly used as thermal barriers because they are relatively inexpensive and easy to install, and they provide a sufficient level of fire protection. The exception for NMC cables states that they are permitted to be used in both exposed and concealed work in dry, moist, damp, or corrosive locations, except as prohibited in 334.10.3. This exception recognizes that NMC cables are designed to be used in a variety of environments, including those where they may be exposed to moisture or corrosive substances. The exception also acknowledges that NMC cables are not as susceptible to fire damage as some other types of cables. However, it's important to note that NMC cables are still subject to certain restrictions. For example, they are not allowed to be used in hazardous locations or where they are exposed to physical damage. The exception for NMC cables is not intended to be a loophole that allows them to be used in any situation. Rather, it's a recognition that NMC cables are a versatile and safe wiring method when used in accordance with the code requirements. The phrase "except as prohibited" in 334.10.3 is an important part of the exception for NMC cables. It clarifies that the exception is not absolute and that there are certain situations where NMC cables are not allowed to be used, even if they meet the other requirements of the exception. Section 334.10.3 of the Electrical Code lists the specific locations where NMC cables are prohibited. These locations typically include areas where the cable is exposed to physical damage, hazardous locations, and underground installations. The specific requirements vary depending on the jurisdiction, so it's important to consult the local electrical code for complete details. The combination of the general rule, the exception for NMC cables, and the limitations outlined in 334.10.3 creates a comprehensive set of requirements that govern the use of NMC cables. By following these requirements, electricians can ensure that NMC cables are used safely and effectively in a variety of applications. The term thermal barrier refers to a material or assembly of materials that provides resistance to the passage of heat. In the context of electrical installations, thermal barriers are used to protect wiring and other electrical components from the effects of fire. The purpose of a thermal barrier is to slow down the spread of heat and flames, giving occupants more time to evacuate a building and allowing firefighters more time to extinguish the fire. Thermal barriers are typically rated based on their ability to withstand exposure to fire for a specific period of time. The rating is expressed in minutes, such as 15 minutes, 30 minutes, or 60 minutes. A thermal barrier with a higher rating provides greater protection against fire. Materials commonly used as thermal barriers include gypsum board, sheetrock, concrete, and fire-rated wood. The specific type and thickness of material required for a thermal barrier will depend on the application and the applicable building codes. In addition to protecting wiring and electrical components, thermal barriers can also be used to protect structural elements of a building, such as walls, floors, and ceilings. By providing resistance to the passage of heat, thermal barriers can help to prevent structural collapse in the event of a fire. The use of thermal barriers is an important part of fire safety in buildings. By slowing down the spread of heat and flames, thermal barriers can help to save lives and protect property. When selecting and installing thermal barriers, it's important to follow all applicable building codes and manufacturer instructions. This will help to ensure that the thermal barrier provides the required level of fire protection. The 15-minute finish rating refers to the amount of time that a thermal barrier can withstand exposure to fire before it begins to fail. This rating is determined by testing the thermal barrier in a laboratory under controlled conditions. The test measures the amount of time that it takes for the temperature on the unexposed side of the thermal barrier to reach a certain level. The 15-minute rating means that the thermal barrier can withstand exposure to fire for at least 15 minutes before the temperature on the unexposed side reaches the specified level. This provides valuable time for occupants to evacuate the building and for firefighters to arrive and extinguish the fire. The finish rating is an important factor to consider when selecting a thermal barrier. The appropriate finish rating will depend on the application and the applicable building codes. In general, a higher finish rating is better as it provides greater protection against fire. However, thermal barriers with higher finish ratings may also be more expensive or more difficult to install. Materials such as 1/2-inch sheetrock are commonly used as thermal barriers because they provide a 15-minute finish rating and are relatively inexpensive and easy to install. However, other materials may be used as well depending on the specific requirements of the application. When installing thermal barriers, it's important to follow all applicable building codes and manufacturer instructions. This will help to ensure that the thermal barrier provides the required level of fire protection. The concept of permitted use refers to the specific applications and conditions under which a particular product, material, or system is allowed to be used according to codes, standards, or regulations. In the context of electrical installations, permitted use defines where and how certain wiring methods, such as NMC cable, can be installed based on factors like location, environmental conditions, and building construction type. For example, the electrical code specifies permitted uses for various types of cables considering factors like whether the location is dry, damp, or corrosive, and whether the cable is exposed or concealed. Understanding permitted use is crucial for ensuring that electrical installations are safe and compliant. Using a product or material in a way that is not permitted can lead to safety hazards, code violations, and potential liability. Codes and standards often include tables, diagrams, and detailed descriptions to clarify the permitted uses for different products and materials. These resources provide guidance on how to select and install the appropriate materials for a given application. When determining the permitted use for a particular product or material, it's important to consider all applicable codes, standards, and regulations. This may include national codes such as the National Electrical Code or NEC, as well as state and local codes. It's also important to consult with qualified professionals such as electricians, engineers, and inspectors who can provide expert guidance on code requirements and best practices. The permitted use for a product or material may be subject to change over time as codes and standards are updated. It's important to stay informed about the latest requirements to ensure that your installations are always compliant. By carefully considering the permitted use for each product and material, you can help to ensure that your electrical installations are safe, reliable, and code compliant. In a provided context, permitted use number 3 outlines specific requirements for cable installations in certain types of building construction. It emphasizes the importance of using thermal barriers to protect cables from fire damage and to prevent the spread of fire. The use of thermal barriers is a critical aspect of fire safety in buildings, and it's essential to follow all applicable code requirements and manufacturer instructions when selecting and installing these barriers. The phrase contradict implies that two statements or rules are in opposition to each other, making it impossible for both to be true or valid at the same time. In the context of codes and regulations, an apparent contradiction can arise when two different sections seem to conflict, creating confusion about which rule to follow. To determine whether a contradiction exists, it's necessary to carefully analyze the wording of each statement and consider the context in which they apply. It may be that the two statements are intended to address different situations, or that one statement is a general rule while the other is a specific exception. In some cases, an apparent contradiction may be the result of an error or oversight in the drafting of the code. If this is the case, it may be necessary to seek clarification or amendment of the code to eliminate the contradiction. When faced with an apparent contradiction, it's always best to consult with qualified professionals such as engineers, inspectors, or code officials who can provide expert guidance and help to resolve the conflict. They can help you to understand the intent behind each statement and to apply the code in a way that is consistent with its overall purpose. In the specific scenario described, the question is whether the requirement for cables to be concealed within thermal barriers contradicts the exception for NMC cables, which allows them to be used in exposed work. The answer is no. There is no contradiction, because the exception for NMC cables is specifically qualified by the phrase except as prohibited in 334.10.3. This means that while NMC cables are generally permitted to be used in exposed work, there are certain situations where they are not allowed, and in those situations, the requirement for thermal barriers would still apply. The non-contradictory nature of the code arises from the specific conditions of use for the cables.